Hello, I am the Paranormal Mr. Pagan, and tonight is Halloween. Personally, I love Halloween. Spooky season is my favorite season. But this year, rather than just be a spectator of the spooky season, I kind of wanted to partake in contributing by taking a bit of a shallow dive in a topic that is very prominent this season. Whether it's TV, movies, or other media, Ouija boards have been a staple of the season, and I realize I see them all the time, but I don't really know much about them. So following the Civil War, the American public was in a period of mourning. Many people were trying to reconcile the fact that many of their family members had gone off to war and just never came back, many of them not even knowing where their final resting place was. Because of this, the spiritualist movement was able to kind of take root and sprout and kind of take a hold of the zeitgeist. This is the time period where you have a lot of mediumship, psychics, as well as public seances. And this wasn't just something that was confined to, the general public. It kind of spanned all the classes, from the commoner all the way up to the first lady of the time, which was Mary Todd Lincoln. Following the death of her son Willie, she held a public seance in the White House, which, that was actually a first in American history. And of course, this was also subject to backlash because it's 2024 and people are still getting comments of, "I rebuke thee, demon," or whatever. Anytime that there's anything remotely just adjacent to Christianity or spiritualists or whatever. So I can imagine back in the day, the pearl clutching was pretty intense. It's also at this time that a lot of tools like pendulums, dowsing rods, and all these other kind of medium tools were kind of taking hold of the public. But one of these, of course, kind of stands heads and shoulders above the rest. And that, of course, is the talking board, also known as the Ouija board. And talking boards had been around for quite a while in many shapes and sizes. It's not until the industrial age that manufacturing allowed us to kind of just mass-produce items. And then it was in 1892 that William Fuld formally introduced the Ouija board, as we know it today, to the general public. Initially just seen as like a board game or a harmless novelty, as you and I know, it ended up being kind of associated with real-life horrors. Horrors. You ever say a word and it just like sounds wrong the more you say it? Anyways, the Ouija board initially was used for many different reasons. For example, just as an icebreaker in a social gathering, for telling small fortunes, or just like other people use it to create art such as poetry, or somebody even wrote a book with it. However, as the years went on, darker stories began popping up little by little, and rumors of mishaps and misfortune kind of started popping up, associating themselves with the Ouija board itself as we know it today. Stories that usually involve people communing with or inviting into their lives, whether it's a dark spirit, entity, demon, or whatever it may be. That being said, I kind of wanted to take the time and go over two stories that really stood out to me when I dove into the subject of Ouija boards. The first one being the classic Roland Doe one that some of you may have heard, but it's my channel. I get to go over it for a first time here. The second one is a little bit more serious. It does involve a public figure, and I'm a little weary of sharing their story. However, should he want me to take this down, I probably will. In the late 1940s, a young Roland Doe was mourning the loss of his Aunt Tilly. Now, he and this aunt were actually pretty close, being that they both shared a very intense interest in spiritualism, the occult, and all of these kind of like esoteric topics. But following her death, strange things started occurring in Roland's house. They would hear the faint sound of dripping noises or tapping, as well as some light scratching all over their wall. They couldn't really explain it, but this kind of planted the seed that it might actually be Tilly, the person who was into the occult and spiritualism and all that stuff. So Roland's mom tells him to grab the Ouija board and they could try and see if they could communicate with her. While they were unable to contact Tilly, they were actually able to speak with some other entities, such as spirits of the home and other landlocked spirits. But unfortunately, none of them were Tilly. So they called it a night and let kind of the strangeness be? However, following the use of the board, things kind of began to escalate. The dripping was no longer as faint as it used to be, neither was the tapping or the scratching. They started noticing that the scratching would pop up on the walls, or on the furniture, or on the sheets, and eventually on young Roland's body. This is also the time that he began to display strange behaviors, being a little shut in and a little more aggressive when his family would kind of approach him. It's also at this point that people believe that Roland was officially possessed. Roland's mom initially took Roland to a psychiatric hospital where they ran a battery of tests to see if they could diagnose and help him out. Unfortunately, they were ultimately unsuccessful. It's also at this time that the psychiatrist points Roland's family towards the Catholic Church. The only problem is that they weren't part of the Catholic faith. But in a moment of desperation, Roland's mom baptizes him into Catholicism to hopefully be able to save his soul. It's at this point where he starts to display violent outbursts and severe reactions to religious iconography. So naturally, the exorcists are called in for this and see if they could finally put an end to the boy's torment. One priest put a crucifix under the boy's pillow to see if it would allow him to, at the very least, rest. They came back the next day to find that the crucifix was actually at the end of the bed, and all the furniture had been kind of tossed about, as well as his bed uncontrollably shaking. It got so intense that at one point, one priest got their nose broken. Roland began spewing piss, spit, and bile, as well as shrieking in Latin and writhing in agony. Pretty intense. I'm pretty sure this is where the movie got its inspiration for that iconic scene. To this point, the demon, or whatever it was, seemed pretty unrelenting. They weren't really sure if it was going to work or not, but as a counterpoint to that violence, things just kind of stopped. As the priest performed their rites, Roland's features kind of relaxed and his body just sank into the bed. The whole ordeal was finally over. Supposedly, Roland then goes on to live a pretty normal life, and supposedly even becoming an engineer at NASA at one point. He didn't really talk about it much. From what I understand, he, one, was afraid that talking about it might bring things back, and two, you talk about demons and shadows and whatever, and people kind of will take you a little less seriously. Especially if, it's the 1960s or 70s and you're an engineer at NASA during quite the pivotal point in the space race. But I understand. But I'm glad that at the very least that story had a happy ending to it. Now, this second story is a little bit more intense. I never thought I would be the type of person to actually give trigger warnings, but I understand that the topic of chop suey can be pretty intense to some, so if you'd like, you can skip to right here or click subscribe to catch me in the next one. So on February 29th of 2023, a paranormal investigator named Colton Kaito shared his experiences with a Ouija board. And Colton, honestly, if you prefer me not talking about this, let me know. I'll take down the video. Now, growing up, Colton was no stranger to the strange and the weird, having grown up on Indian burial grounds. Now, he'd see things out of the corner of his eyes, as well as coming home after school to find that his furniture had been moved around. He was not just interested in it, but he was living it. Regardless, nothing could actually prepare Colton for what he was about to experience. He starts by explaining that his friend had an older brother who had a Ouija board, and that for months this friend was pestering, Colton and his group to play with it. But as anyone probably would, they hesitate at first because, when somebody brings up the prospect of using one, you kind of associate it with all the urban horror stories, so you kind of prefer to not partake. But this friend was actually pretty relentless about it, and they all kind of agreed to do it. Before using the Ouija board, he shares that he and his friends would go out to the desert and just kind of do what teenagers do and just try and find literally anything to kill the boredom. It's during one of these escapades that they find an old dilapidated stable, where he explains that even without using the Ouija board at this time, they had experienced just a lot of strangeness. He talks about hearing the sound of hooves just galloping in the distance without anything being out there in the desert with them, as well as hearing shrieks and yells and just like spooky noises in general. Again, this is without even using the Ouija board. And as teenagers, I don't really fault them too much for this, but like, damn, bro. Like, I understand. You know, you're again, they're trying to kill the boredom, so they do what teenagers do. They didn't really know any better. Bolton explains that they did not have the best etiquette when it came to the board and following all the rules of standing up and of goodbye or whatever. But even so, they managed to contact the spirit for about 30 minutes. They asked them a bunch of questions at a time. Who are you? When did you die? How did you die? Until the whole experience kind of became a little too spooky. So they called it a night. They blew out the candles and then they left, and they thought that was that. Following the use of the board, he expresses that one of his friends, who was normally a warm and bubbly person, felt a little off and reserved, but he didn't really think much of it because, he was also one of the younger kids. The following Monday at school, he finds that his friend isn't in school, so he just, after class, reaches out to the mom, and she explains that the friend wasn't feeling very well. That he would just be sitting in his room quietly, not really engaging when he was approached or anything like that. Now, Colton felt bad at this point. He wanted to let the mom know what they had done over the weekend, but they were kids. He didn't want to get in trouble. But following that phone call, days turned to weeks, and his friend was still nowhere to be seen, and so he reached out again. And well, unfortunately, he finds out what really happened to his friend. It's at this point in the video where Colton kind of talks to camera and reaches out to his audience and really just expresses the fact that Ouija boards aren't just novelty items. They're not toys. They're not, they're not these innocent things. And he doesn't want people to misuse these items. To the point where he himself says that he's not one to mess with these things. Of course, these stories serve as a cautionary tale to not mess with things that you don't really understand. People are still gonna do it. I mean, the other day, Charlie, Wendigoon, and Meat Canyon uploaded a video about them messing around with one. And probably things don't happen more often than they don't. The problem is that when these things do happen, they're usually not great. William Fuld is said to be a victim of the board itself. It's said that he and his brother had a huge falling out to the point where their sides of the family did not speak for about 96 years. Also, Fuld himself was said to have died in an accident in the same manufacturing site that the board told him to build. Who knows? Now, whether you believe or not, these stories will kind of always exist. Anything that has to do with the dark and the spooky and the unknown will always kind of grip our imaginations. That's why I think people will always continue to play with these things. Now, I personally have some strong opinions about Ouija boards. I feel like people open themselves up to anything when using the board, rather than trying to contact someone or something directly, and so they don't really get the best experiences out of it. That's also just from anecdotal experiences that I've heard. People who really dabble with this sort of thing and have had a successful experience with it. I mean, we talked about initially in the video that this was kind of an innocuous party thing, and it wasn't until later on that it became associated with the dark. I think it's just a tool, but a hammer is also a tool, and it could be used for good and not so good. I myself haven't really played with a Ouija board yet, but maybe someday I'll mess around with one following some precautions. I'm a bit of a scaredy cat when it comes to that stuff. If you have any stories of anything spooky or spooky adjacent, please let me know down below. Like and subscribe, and I'll be back with more spooky content in a couple days. Also, I really want to thank AJ and Charlotte. Thank you guys for being the best, and I'll see you next time. That's probably a really bad video, but then again, I don't care. I'm done. It's over. C'est fini.